Hi everybody, it's Liz here for English Curriculum Studies 1. This lecture addresses two frameworks that we can use when we're thinking about how we can cater for our students' different intelligences and ways of learning. It applies to the Week 3 activities and to the first assessment task. Just to start off, our learning goals for the lecture, I'm hoping that by the end you'll be able to understand the theories behind multiple intelligences and Bloom's taxonomy, and that you'll understand practical ways to incorporate both of those into your lessons. How will you know if you can do this? Well, can you define multiple intelligences and Bloom's taxonomy? And can you list the strategies that you could use to differentiate in your lessons? We're going to start off thinking about multiple intelligences. Firstly, thinking about a traditional way of thinking about it, about intelligences. So firstly, what does it mean to be intelligent in our society? We often think of it as a capacity, intelligence as a capacity that everybody has to some extent, some more than others. And we often think that it's something that we're born with and that there's not much you can do about it. Our schools tend to promote certain abilities more than others. For example, having a wide vocabulary is something that might serve students well at school. If we think about the kinds of learning activities and assessment pieces that we give, having a wide vocabulary that students can draw on is something that schools do value. The ability to analyse texts is another ability that schools value. Being able to solve maths problems. Having strong memories for information retention, so if we think about the way that lessons are structured and the fact that it's a huge chunk of information that we give students across one school day, having a strong memory is certainly an advantage. And being able to solve problems quickly. So schools can be quite fast-paced. So if students have the ability to work quickly, that's an advantage as well. In terms of measuring a person's intelligence, traditionally IQ tests are used and they produce a numerical score. So that's a traditional way of thinking about intelligence. A man called Howard Gardner in the early 1980s wanted to challenge that traditional idea, and he provided an alternative to that quite narrow view. So he said that I would like to present an alternative vision, one based on a radically different view of the mind, and one that yields a very different view of school. It is a pluralistic view of mind, recognising many different and discrete facets of cognition, acknowledging that people have different cognitive strengths and contrasting cognitive styles. So he was trying to broaden the definition of intelligence. He came up with 8 intelligences. There are 8 criterion that he uses to develop an intelligence. People have challenged him over the years to add different types of intelligences, but he says that those ones can't be matched against every one of the criterion. We're going to walk through each one just briefly, then we're going to watch a YouTube video that just explains this in a slightly different way. So firstly, linguistic intelligence or word smart. Have a read of that one. We might know people who just have a way with words, very clever at manipulating their vocabulary, at writing, so they might be said to have a linguistic intelligence. The second one is logical mathematical. Have a read of that. Some people refer to this one as being number smart, but I like to refer to it more as being logic smart because it's more than just numbers. It's about being able to look for patterns, relationships. Sciences often would prioritise this kind of thinking. The third one is spatial. So picture smart. Perhaps you're thinking about people that you know who have a preference for one of these types of intelligences so far. The next is bodily kinesthetic, or body smart. So using movement to learn. Musical, music smart. There's certainly been people in history who we could say have a really strong musical intelligence, and some of your students might do. So we can find ways to incorporate that into our teaching. Instruments are not required. Interpersonal, so people smart. And on the flip side of that is intrapersonal, so self-smart. The last intelligence of gardeners is naturalist, and this is a more recent one that was added. So these are the 8 intelligences that everybody possesses to some extent. You might find that you have a preference for one, or a couple of them, and others you're quite weak in, and it's the same for our students. So it's about understanding these preferences and planning our lessons according to those where possible. So now that we've looked at the intelligences, which ones do we think are most valued by schools and society? Well, English and social sciences really rely on a strong linguistic intelligence, being able to read, interpret, analyse, use language to get our ideas across. Maths and science have a preference for the logical mathematical intelligence. We do have, as I've just said, more than one intelligence, so we all have all of these intelligences to some extent. So in terms of what it means for you, we can think about how we could adapt our classroom and activities and our assessment to consider multiple intelligences. If we really did recognise them, we might have more variety and flexibility in our resources and our activities that we plan, so giving students more choice, providing things that perhaps suit them a little bit more, rather than placing preference on one particular intelligence, like linguistic. And in terms of assessment, giving more options for students to show what they know, understand, and can do. One point to make here is that it doesn't mean that students shouldn't do activities that use an intelligence that they're not really strong at. It just means that sometimes when we're planning, we need to consider how we could incorporate all the types of intelligences. So not all the time. And of course we need to experience the different intelligences to help develop them. And it's just not feasible to cater for every single student's intelligence all of the time, but it's just one more consideration, some extra knowledge that can help us in our planning. So how will you know your students' multiple intelligences? There are some really basic tests that we can give our students. You could certainly, even on your prac, you could give your students a quiz like this where they just mark down true or false in response to the statements. And then you tally them up and then it gives you a sense of, I think it goes in numbers, so you can look at the numbers and see which intelligences they're strongest at. So once you have the information about what their intelligences are, tell your students. So I think that part of good teaching is teaching learning metalanguage. It's important for our students to understand how they learn and how they learn better, so that when they go home and somebody asks them, what did you learn at school today, they can talk about more than the content. They can talk about how they learn. They can say, well, I know that I learn better when I draw my learning. So it's helping them to unlock the door to learning, lifelong learning, if they have this kind of information. Also know your own intelligence. That might reveal where your own preferences are. Chapter 6 of Thomas has lots of different strategies. The reference is on Blackboard, and it's also at the end of these slides. So this is just a brief summary of some different types of activities that we could plan for the different intelligences. And I'm sure that you could see across a lesson, you could incorporate lots of these. Remembering that we're always doing lots of different things within a lesson, there's certainly opportunities to incorporate a number of these. So we're going to watch a brief YouTube video now. I chose this one because it presents it in terms of different modes of teaching. So it talks about the intelligences and how we can consider those through different modes of teaching. I'll pop over here.
The three styles of teaching that I employ in a multiple intelligence classroom are teacher-centered, student-centered, and inquiry-based learning. Each of these styles creates a dynamic learning opportunity. Let's go into more detail about all of these teaching styles. A teacher-centered classroom is a great way to share a lot of information in a short period of time. Traditionally, this approach is a one-way communication model, and it also limits the multiple intelligences to one or two at a time. For example, if a teacher is talking or writing on the board, they're using a linguistic intelligence. If a class takes a field trip, they're experiencing a naturalist and a kinesthetic intelligence. If a teacher plays a video, the students are experiencing a visual intelligence. Students need the opportunity to respond and react to lessons. A teacher-centered approach allows for whole class engagement and continuous feedback between the teacher and the students, also known as the Socratic method. Using activities such as labs, think, pair, share, tableaus, is a great opportunity for students to have time to respond and react during a lesson. For example, in a teacher-centered MI lesson on fractions, a teacher pauses after an explanation of the difference between half and third and asks students to provide a nature smart example. For visual or logic smart students, a teacher creates a number line on the board. Students choose a card from a pile and place the fraction in sequence from largest fraction to smallest. In this way, MI theory gives the teacher-centered classroom a new spin, helping students to become active participants in their learning. A teacher-centered MI approach is about providing opportunities to explore the 8 intelligences at different times and through different contexts. The class works as a whole, but helps each other to have a more concrete understanding of the topics. Learning through the multiple intelligences in this way helps to create significant cognitive abilities while simultaneously developing social skills. A student-centered approach allows students to express their understanding of a topic through an intelligence of their choosing. This ensures full participation and leadership amongst all students. A student-centered lesson typically comes after a lesson has been taught or a new concept. It allows students to demonstrate their understanding of the topic. The key to student-centered MI lessons is choice. Activities such as these allow students to take the center stage during lessons carefully scaffolded by the teachers. Student-centered lessons can take two forms, folder activities or pinwheel activities. Folder activities ask students to respond to a specific concept using a graphic organizer to guide them. Lit circles are an excellent lesson to use with folder activities. For example, after a lesson on characterization, students choose one of 8 folder activities. A body-smart character detective asks students to recreate 2 key scenes using claymation that demonstrate the internal and external characteristics of the main character. Pinwheel activities are student-centered and hands-on. They are quick to plan and focus on a topic of the teacher's choosing. For example, in a science class, students demonstrate their understanding of volcanoes. A word-smart student writes a newspaper article about a recent explosion. A body-smart student designs a cinder cone volcano and simulates an eruption. A logic-smart student uses Google Earth to research and document active volcanoes in North America. For more information on planning student-centered lessons for folder or pinwheel activities, check out my book, Multiple Intelligences in the Everyday Classroom. The last style of teaching is known as inquiry-based lessons. This type of lesson combines the elements of both the teacher and the student-centered lesson. They are also known as station activities. Inquiry-based lessons are ideal for extending and reinforcing key ideas and concepts. They can come in the form of short-term activities or long-term projects that culminate in a museum tour hosted by students. The inquiry-based approach allows students to work independently or in small groups. Students are given materials and a common learning objective for each assignment, much like student-centered activities. A large difference is that inquiry-based activities are open-ended. For example, students studying ecosystems design their own experiments. One student looks at mold rates on bread. Another student looks at the anatomy and cell structure of different types of leaves. Yet another student looks at the popularity of different types of recycling modules. Inquiry-based lessons are usually set up in one of two ways, as extension projects or as learning centers. Students at a music center learning about fractions listen to a song and complete a worksheet to review math facts. A linguistic center provides word searches, crosswords, and similar word puzzles to help students focus on new vocabulary. A visual center provides colored fraction wheels and various colored manipulatives that help students conceptualize fractions. A nature center provides a series of maps with coordinates that are set in fractions and tasks the students to find specific locations. The range of possibilities is endless. These centers are ideal for students who wish to extend their learning or engage in bonus activities.
Okay, so I hope that gave you some ideas about the types of ways that we could incorporate intelligences into our lessons. And it was also interesting to see the different kinds of activities that we could use across the different modes of teaching or the different types of lessons. So as an example for English specifically, just open up a new document. So let's say, for example, it was a unit of work for Year 10 English, looking at documentaries and looking at how viewers are being positioned to think about the topic of the documentary. So for our music smart students, we could get them to make up a rhyme for new vocabulary. So this is a lesson right at the start of the unit where we're getting students orientated to the content of the unit. So a rhyme for new vocabulary. You could get them to keep a beat while reading. And they can do that quietly, just with their foot or tapping the desk. So keeping a beat while reading can help them to retain more information. For our visual students, we could get them to do a storyboard or a comic strip of what they're learning about. So if we're teaching about different techniques, we could get them to do a storyboard that represents that. Or we could get them to do some non-linguistic representations of concepts. So when we're teaching about different camera shots, you could ask them to come up with a non-linguistic representation for the different types of camera angles and views. This is also the kinds of strategies that work really well for some types of boys. And then kinesthetic. We could get them to get up and write on the board. Okay, just involving them in that way can help them. We could get them to write notes on a flashcard that can be organised, so categorised or classified. Okay, so ordering them in some way. And you can get them to do dictation into a voice recorder. And if you get them to do it while they're walking, that can help them. So those are just some ideas for 3 different types of intelligences. And it will be fairly easy to incorporate all of those into one lesson. So that's the overview for multiple intelligences. The YouTube link is there if you wanted to go back and have another look at that video. The second part of the lecture is about Bloom's taxonomy. So we're thinking about why some tasks that we undertake are harder than others. Why do we find some things really easy to do and others take us hours and hours and hours to do? And one reason lies in how complex the skill is that you're applying to complete that task. So Bloom's taxonomy is a way of thinking about the layers of skills and the increasing complexity of skills. This reference from Reeves is at the end of the slides as well. So there are 6 categories. He says that each of the 6 categories is a mental skill or ability that individuals may learn to use. We can demonstrate mastery of these skills and abilities by engaging in certain activities. In general, the list proceeds from simpler skills to more complex ones, and to some extent, the simpler activities, such as remembering, are necessary for mastery of more complex abilities, such as applying. In many cases, practicing more complex skills promotes mastery of simpler ones, as when analysis results in firmer comprehension of an idea. So I'll show you the visual. It was originally from 1956, and there was a revision in 2001. Particularly, knowledge became remembering, so making it a verb. Okay? So because they are thinking skills, it's an active process. And the revision was also made to account for new technologies and an increase in the amount of information that we process. And the higher end was adjusted. So we can see down the bottom, remembering is a lot less complex than when we make our way up, evaluating and creating. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. These are the processes here and a definition of each one. And I've put in italics here some of the verbs, activities that or thinking processes that we might undertake at each level. So when we remember, it might be recognising or recalling. So I'll give you a moment just to have a read of the definition for each one. Okay, this is just a slightly different representation of what was on the previous slide. It also adds in questions that we can ask of our students. And there are just a few more of the verbs here. So whenever I write a learning goal, or when I give activities for students to do in class, I always try to use one of these verbs. And I almost always will bold that verb to make it really clear exactly what process I'm asking students to use. So, in for understanding, describe. asking them to discuss whatever you put into your learning goal. You will try and make the verb really clear so that it's easy for students to understand what they need to do. We'll watch a short YouTube video about this. When I was searching, there are lots of different videos that explain the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy in relation to pop culture references. Like there was one for Harry Potter, Seinfeld, Pirates of the Caribbean. So if you're interested in looking at it in that kind of way, you can have a search for that. Okay.
Bloom's taxonomy is a categorization of learning objectives and goals when teaching. It was proposed in 1956 by a team of educators led by Benjamin Bloom. Benjamin Samuel Bloom was an American educational psychologist who made influences to the classification of educational learning objectives and to the concept of mastery learning. Bloom's taxonomy divides the educational learning objectives into 3 areas or domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. The goal of Bloom's taxonomy is to motivate educators to focus on all 3 areas, creating a more rounded form of education. One area that I would like to focus on is the cognitive domain or thinking skills. According to Bloom's taxonomy, this domain can be broken down into 6 categories. First, we have knowledge. This is recalling or remembering learned material. The second is comprehension. This is understanding the material. The third is application. This is using or applying the previously learned information to new and unfamiliar situations. The fourth is analysis. This is breaking material down to increase understanding or examining and trying to understand the organizational structure of information. The fifth is synthesis, applying prior knowledge and reshaping material into a new form. And the last is evaluation, judging the worth of the material to some set of criteria without real, right, or wrong answers. Now that there is an understanding of Bloom's taxonomy, how can we use this in the classroom? Asking students to think at higher levels is a way to encourage students' thought process. Different types of questions require us to use different levels of thinking. Here are some examples of using Bloom's taxonomy verb chart. Number 1, under knowledge, you may use the words recall, underline, list, name, record, or label. Number 2, comprehension. You may use the words understand, show, summarize, explain, describe, and demonstrate. Number 3, application. You may use the words apply, select, model, organize, illustrate, or choose. Number 4, analysis. You may use the words that include compare, contrast, classify, map, divide, and examine. Number 5, synthesis. You may use the words construct, design, compose, and develop. And the last one, evaluation. You may use the words convince, argue, judge, rate, or persuade. Today, teachers must make tough decisions about how to spend their classroom time. Everything must fit properly. Bloom's taxonomy has been changed or, quote, revised over the past couple of years. This is a framework that is a work in progress.
Okay, so you might notice that video referred to a lot of the earlier concepts, but the idea is similar in that it makes a difference to how we plan our lessons. So if we know what Bloom's taxonomy is, then what? So we write our lesson objectives using the verbs. We plan our learning experiences around the different levels of thinking. Now there are lots of resources on Blackboard for you. So have a look through those and that will give you some ideas. It also matters when we're thinking about questioning to the students. So encouraging them throughout the unit to think at different levels. And on that point, we need to relate the levels to the phase of the unit. So in the orientating phase of the unit, you're not going to be asking them to do things like analysing and creating and evaluating. You're going to be doing basic things like asking them to remember information and understand information. During the enhancing phase, you'll be doing things like asking them to apply and doing a little bit of analysis. So you can see how you gradually increase the level of complexity that you're asking students to engage in. So to sum up, why are we bothering with multiple intelligences and Bloom's taxonomy? Well, you might choose to include these on your lesson planning to show your teacher, your supervising teacher and yourself that you have considered a range of learners, that you understand that students learn in different ways and that there are ways that we can cater for those different learning styles. If we do try to cater for different types of learners, we've got a greater chance of engaging students, and that could very well lead to fewer classroom management difficulties. If you've got a class full of students who are engaged in what they're doing because in some way what you're asking them to do suits them, then you might have less issues to contend with. Imagine a lesson where it's 45 minutes of just writing. Well, that wouldn't suit a whole lot of your students. So it's about incorporating some variety into your lessons to cater for different types of students. And all of this comes from knowing your students and understanding how they learn best. So when you're on prac, either before prac, if you're in email contact with them, ask for some information about the students. Just a few notes on the students and anything that you might want to know about the way they learn. Or you could ask your students to complete one of the MI surveys that I showed you earlier when you first meet them. And then you'll get a really good sense. You might see ways to group the students, or you might see that the majority of students have a particular intelligence. So it's about getting that information. There are resources to help you on Blackboard. I'll hop into there. Sorry, I haven't opened it yet. I'll just show you where they are. Okay, so under Learning Resources, Useful Documents and Links, and we've got Multiple Intelligences and Bloom's Taxonomy here. Okay, so there are some different documents there, some examples, questioning techniques, and then links to 2 of the books that have lots of strategies in there. So those are some resources to help you. Use some of these for your first assignment. Okay, it might give you some activity ideas. Okay, so checking back with our learning goals and success criteria, I hope that now you're able to define what a multiple intelligence is and what Bloom's taxonomy is, and that you have an idea of some different strategies that you could use in your lesson to differentiate.